Welcome to the channel Stories of Slavery. I'm sure that today's story, Lydia Moore's story from Georgia in 1862, will touch your heart deeply. So relax, stay quiet for a moment, and listen carefully. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and write in the comments which city you're listening from. Your participation helps keep these stories alive. Let's begin. Georgia, 1862. The war had been raging for over a year when Lydia Moore first understood that her hands could create miracles that her life would never allow her to claim. She was 10 years old, barefoot, wearing a dress made from flour sacks that hung loose on her undernourished frame. Her fingers were calloused from picking cotton since she was old enough to carry a sack, her back already developing the permanent curve that marked her people, her eyes holding shadows no child should carry. Magnolia Creek Plantation sat isolated in the red clay hills of central Georgia, far enough from the war's main theaters that life continued in its brutal routine despite the distant thunder of cannons. The plantation had belonged to the Vance family for 3 generations, passed down through careful marriages and ruthless business practices that had accumulated both land and human property in equal measure. Master Harold Vance had died the previous winter, leaving the estate to his widow Eleanor and their adult son Marcus, who had promptly enlisted in the Confederate cavalry and ridden off to defend Southern honor, leaving his mother to manage 300 acres and 47 enslaved people with only an aging overseer and her own bitter determination. Eleanor Vance was 42 years old and consumed by disappointments that had curdled into a vinegar sourness that poisoned everything she touched. She had been pretty once, or so people said, but years of Georgia sun and unfulfilled ambitions had hardened her features into something sharp and unforgiving. In her youth she had fancied herself an artist, had taken lessons from an itinerant portrait painter who had passed through Savannah, had filled sketchbooks with competent but uninspired drawings of flowers and buildings, and the occasional stiff portrait. She had dreamed of recognition, of her work hanging in parlors and galleries, of being known as more than just another plantation wife. But her work was mediocre, and she knew it, which made the knowing worse than ignorance would have been. Her paintings were technically adequate but soulless, the kind of art that provoked polite compliments and was then forgotten the moment the viewer turned away. She had married Harold Vance partly because he had praised her watercolors effusively, though she suspected even then that he was praising her dowry rather than her talent. After marriage, she had continued painting sporadically, but motherhood and plantation management had consumed her time, and her lack of genuine gift had consumed her enthusiasm. By the time Harold died, Eleanor's easel had been gathering dust for 5 years, a monument to dreams that had withered on the vine. Lydia Moore belonged to Magnolia Creek the way the cotton plants and the red clay soil belonged to it, which is to say she was considered property rather than person, asset rather than human, a thing that could be bought and sold and worked and discarded according to the needs and whims of those who owned the land. Her mother Ruth was the plantation seamstress, skilled with needle and thread, tasked with making and mending clothes for both the enslaved community and occasionally for the Vance family when Eleanor didn't want to pay town prices. Her father had been sold away when Lydia was 3 years old, traded for a breeding mare and some cash to settle a gambling debt. Lydia barely remembered him, except as a feeling of safety that had disappeared one morning and never returned. Ruth had raised her daughter in the desperate way enslaved mothers raised children, trying to keep her safe while knowing that safety was an illusion that could shatter any moment the white folks decided otherwise. She taught Lydia to be invisible, to keep her eyes down, to speak only when spoken to endure without complaint because complaint meant the whip or worse. She taught her the songs that carried coded messages of resistance and hope, taught her about the drinking gourd in the sky that pointed north toward freedom, taught her to believe that somehow, someday, things might be different even though neither of them could imagine how. What Ruth couldn't teach, couldn't control, couldn't suppress, was the gift that had manifested in Lydia's hands almost as soon as she could hold a stick. The child drew constantly, compulsively, with whatever materials she could find. She drew in the dust of the cabin floor using her finger, creating images so precise and detailed that other enslaved people would stop their work to stare. She drew on the walls of the cotton barn, using charcoal from the fire, sketching the mules and chickens and other slaves with an accuracy that seemed impossible for someone so young who had never received a moment of formal instruction. She collected blackberry juice in a stolen tin cup and used it as paint, applying it to scraps of cloth with a brush made from her own hair tied to a stick. She would study a face or a tree or a bird with an intensity that made her seem absent from her own body, her eyes cataloguing every detail, her mind somehow translating what she saw into marks on surfaces that captured not just the appearance, but the essence of her subjects. When she drew her mother's face on a piece of bark using a nail, Ruth had wept because she saw herself truly reflected there, saw her own exhaustion and love and sorrow rendered with a tenderness that transcended the crude materials. The other enslaved people recognized Lydia's gift as something extraordinary and slightly frightening, a manifestation of power in a powerless person, a flowering of beauty in a place designed to crush all beauty that didn't serve white interests. Old Isaiah, who claimed to remember Africa, though most doubted the truth of that claim, said Lydia carried the spirit of the ancestors, that she had been marked by forces older than slavery, that her hands were instruments of something the white folks couldn't own, no matter how many papers said they owned her body. Ruth was proud of her daughter's gift and terrified of it in equal measure, because anything that made you special also made you vulnerable, made you visible, made you a target. Lydia drew because she couldn't not draw, because something inside her demanded expression regardless of circumstances, because art was the only language she had for feelings too large and complex for a 10-year-old to articulate otherwise. She drew the cotton fields, but gave the plants faces that screamed silently. She drew the plantation house as a beautiful monster, all graceful columns and predatory angles. She drew her own hands covered in invisible chains. She drew freedom as a bird flying toward a sun she'd never seen except in dreams. For months, Lydia's art remained contained within the enslaved quarters, hidden from white eyes, a secret kept by people who understood that anything precious must be protected from those who would steal or destroy it. But secrets on plantations were fragile things, sustained by collective will, but vulnerable to accident and circumstance. The accident came in late summer when Lydia was sent to the main house to help her mother with mending work, carrying a basket of torn linens that needed repair. While her mother worked in the sewing room, Lydia waited in the hallway, bored and restless. She found a piece of charcoal that had fallen from a scuttle near a fireplace, found a relatively clean section of wall hidden behind a tall cabinet, and in the 15 minutes she was left alone, she drew. She drew without thinking, her hands moving automatically, creating the image of a dead bird she had seen that morning lying beneath the magnolia tree. A small brown sparrow with its wings spread and its eyes empty, beautiful and terrible in its absolute stillness. Eleanor Vance discovered the drawing when she moved the cabinet later that afternoon, looking for a dropped earring. She stood frozen, staring at the charcoal sketch on her wall, her mind struggling to process what she was seeing. The drawing was magnificent. Not good or promising or interesting, magnificent. The technical skill would have been impressive in a trained adult artist. The emotional resonance, the way the dead bird seemed to embody mortality itself, was the work of someone with profound and mature understanding of beauty and loss. Eleanor's first thought was that someone had snuck into her house and created this drawing as some kind of prank or message. Her second thought, when she noticed charcoal smudges on the floor leading back toward the sewing room, was that perhaps her seamstress Ruth had hidden artistic talent. Her third thought When she stormed into the sewing room and saw 10-year-old Lydia with charcoal dust still on her small fingers, was the thought that would seal the child's fate. This slave girl could paint, and Eleanor Vance could claim those paintings as her own. The realization hit Eleanor with the force of revelation. Here was the answer to all her disappointments, the solution to all her failed ambitions. She didn't need to develop talent she didn't possess. She just needed to control access to talent that already existed. Who would question her? Who would believe that a slave child, an illiterate piece of property, could create art that rivaled the master's? The very absurdity of the truth would make the lie unassailable. Eleanor sent Ruth away on an errand and closed the sewing room door. She sat down across from Lydia, studying the child with new eyes, seeing not a human being but a resource to be exploited, a tool to be used, a secret to be kept. She asked Lydia in a deceptively gentle voice if the child had made the drawing on the wall. Lydia, terrified of punishment, tried to deny it. But Eleanor had seen the charcoal on her fingers, had seen the way the child's eyes had flickered with recognition when confronted with the image. Eleanor didn't punish Lydia for drawing on the wall. Instead, she did something far more cruel. She smiled, a cold stretching of lips that never reached her eyes, and told Lydia that she had a special gift, that she was going to have a special job now, that she was very lucky because not every slave got to work in the big house. She told Lydia she would be moving into the basement of the main house, into a room that would be set up just for her, where she would make beautiful pictures that would help the plantation and help her people. Lydia didn't understand at first, didn't grasp the true nature of what was being proposed. She just knew that something bad was happening, something that made her stomach hurt and her skin feel cold. She asked if her mama could come too, and Eleanor's smile grew sharper as she explained that no, Ruth would stay in the quarters where she belonged. But Lydia would be able to see her mother sometimes if she was good and did what she was told. Then Eleanor explained the rules, and Lydia began to understand the trap that had closed around her. Lydia would paint pictures. Eleanor would sign them and show them and sell them. Nobody would ever know that Lydia had painted them. If Lydia told anyone, if she refused to paint, if she tried to run away or hurt herself or otherwise failed in her duties, then Ruth would be sold to the sugar plantations in Louisiana. Eleanor described those plantations in detail, her voice pleasant and factual, as she explained how slaves there died within 5 years from the brutal work and disease and heat, how Ruth would spend her last days cutting cane in swamps full of snakes and mosquitoes, how she would die far from anyone who loved her and be buried in an unmarked grave. Lydia was 10 years old. She understood enough to know she had no choice. She could paint, or her mother would die. That was the bargain, simple and terrible and absolute. That night, Lydia was moved from the cabin she shared with her mother to the basement of the main house. The basement had been used for storage, a damp stone room with a small window near the ceiling that let in a square of light during the day and nothing at night. Eleanor had it cleared out and furnished with an easel, a small table, a pile of canvases, and painting supplies that had belonged to her own abandoned artistic pursuits. There was a thin mattress on the floor for sleeping, a chamber pot in the corner, and an oil lamp that gave off more smoke than light. There was also a chain, attached to a bolt in the wall that could be locked around Lydia's ankle. Eleanor explained that the chain was necessary to make sure Lydia didn't wander around the house at night and disturb anyone. She said it almost apologetically, as if this were a minor inconvenience rather than the literal shackling of a child. The chain was long enough to let Lydia reach the easel and the table and the mattress and the chamber pot, but not long enough to reach the door or the window. Long enough to work, not long enough to escape. That first night alone in the basement, Lydia cried until she had no tears left, until her body was empty of everything but fear and grief. She thought about her mother, about the cabin that was small and crowded, but filled with love, about the songs and stories and embraces that had made even slavery bearable. She thought about the other children she had played with, about the communal meals and the whispered conversations and the network of care that existed in the quarters despite everything designed to break it. Now she was alone. Truly, completely alone. In a way she had never been alone before. The basement was cold, despite the Georgia heat, the stone walls seeming to absorb warmth rather than hold it. The darkness, when Eleanor finally took the lamp away, was absolute, thick and suffocating, full of sounds Lydia couldn't identify. She lay on the thin mattress and felt the weight of the chain on her ankle, and understood that her life had ended, even though she was still breathing. The next morning, Eleanor returned with breakfast, a bowl of thin gruel and a piece of bread, better food than Lydia usually got, but still barely adequate. She also brought a book of paintings, reproductions of famous European works, and laid it open on the table. She pointed to a landscape, a pastoral scene of rolling hills and distant mountains, and a river winding through green fields, and told Lydia to copy it onto a canvas. Lydia had never painted before. She had drawn with charcoal and improvised with berry juice, but she had never used real paints, never worked with oils and brushes and canvas. Eleanor showed her the basics, how to mix colors on a palette, how to load the brush, how to apply paint in layers. The instruction was perfunctory and impatient, less like teaching and more like explaining how to operate a machine. Then Eleanor left Lydia alone with the canvas and the paints, and the expectation that genius would manifest on command. For a long time, Lydia just stared at the blank canvas, at the paints that smelled strange and chemical, at the brushes with their different sizes and shapes. Her hand shook when she finally picked up a brush. The paint felt wrong, too thick and slippery compared to the charcoal and berry juice she was used to. Her first strokes were tentative and clumsy, creating muddy colors that bore no resemblance to the painting she was supposed to copy. But Lydia had the gift, and the gift didn't care about circumstances or materials or the broken heart of the vessel that contained it. Within an hour, her hands found their rhythm. Within 2 hours, she had begun to understand how oils behaved differently from her improvised mediums, but followed similar principles. Within 3 hours, the landscape was taking shape on the canvas, and it was becoming clear that Lydia could not only copy the painting Eleanor had shown her, but could improve upon it, adding depth and emotion that the original lacked. By evening, when Eleanor returned, the painting was finished. Eleanor stood in front of it for a full minute without speaking, her face cycling through expressions Lydia couldn't read. Surprise, satisfaction, something that might have been greed, something else that looked almost like rage. Finally, she told Lydia that the work was acceptable, that tomorrow she would begin a portrait, that Lydia should eat her dinner and sleep because there would be more work ahead. The routine established itself with brutal efficiency. Every morning, Eleanor brought food and gave Lydia her assignment, a landscape to copy, a portrait to paint from a photograph, a still life composition. Every evening, Eleanor collected the finished work and gave her next instructions. Days blurred together, distinguished only by which painting Lydia was working on, which colors she was mixing, which techniques she was teaching herself through trial and error. The isolation was worse than the work. Lydia existed in a liminal space, neither in the house nor in the quarters, neither slave nor artisan, neither child nor adult. She was a secret, a ghost, a tool that produced valuable art and was otherwise irrelevant. She saw her mother once a week, visits that Eleanor allowed as reward for good work and denied as punishment for any resistance. Those visits were torture of a different kind. 15 minutes of desperate embracing and whispered assurances. Ruth trying to pretend everything would be all right while her eyes showed she knew it wouldn't. Lydia trying to be brave while her soul screamed for rescue that would never come. The basement became Lydia's entire world. She learned its dimensions by heart, every crack in the stone walls, every variation in the damp smell, every position where the small window let in the most light. She learned to paint by lamplight when Eleanor demanded work done quickly, learned to ignore the headaches from the oil fumes and the smoke, learned to function on inadequate food and inadequate sleep, and the complete absence of anything resembling joy. She painted landscapes that would never be her landscape, mountains she would never climb, oceans she would never see. She painted portraits of white people from photographs Eleanor brought, wealthy planters and their wives and children, people who smiled into the camera with the confidence of those who had never doubted their right to exist. Lydia captured their likenesses with precision, but couldn't help adding something to their eyes. A hint of cruelty in the men, a shadow of complicity in the women, a disturbing emptiness in the children. Eleanor never seemed to notice these subtle rebellions, or if she did, she didn't care because the technical quality was so high that any emotional ambiguity could be dismissed as artistic interpretation. After 3 months, Eleanor began showing Lydia's work to select visitors, claiming the paintings as her own creation. She told elaborate stories about her artistic awakening after her husband's death, about how grief had unlocked something in her creative spirit, about how she painted in frenzies of inspiration that left her exhausted but fulfilled. The visitors believed her because they had no reason not to, because the paintings existed, and Eleanor possessed them, and the alternative explanation was unthinkable. A Charleston art dealer saw one of the landscapes and offered to show Eleanor's work in his gallery. Eleanor accepted, and within weeks, paintings that Lydia had created in a basement prison were being sold to wealthy Confederates for prices that made Eleanor's eyes gleam with satisfaction. The money-funded uniforms and supplies for Confederate soldiers supported the very system that kept Lydia in chains, transformed her gift into fuel for the machinery of her own oppression. Eleanor became more demanding. She wanted more paintings, faster production, higher quality. She brought Lydia increasingly complex assignments, testing the limits of her abilities. She also became paranoid about the secret being discovered, about Lydia somehow communicating the truth to someone who might believe it. The visits with Ruth became less frequent, then stopped altogether. Eleanor said Ruth had been reassigned to field work, that she was too busy to visit, but Lydia suspected Eleanor was simply cutting off her last remaining connection to humanity. The isolation deepened into something beyond loneliness. Lydia began to feel herself disappearing, her sense of self eroding under the relentless pressure of being nothing but hands that painted, nothing but a tool that created art for others to claim. She stopped dreaming at night, or if she dreamed, she didn't remember. She stopped thinking about escape or rescue or any future beyond the next painting. She existed in an eternal present of mixing colors and applying brushstrokes and creating beauty that meant nothing to her because it was stolen the moment it was finished. 6 months into her imprisonment, as winter settled over Georgia and the basement grew so cold that Lydia's fingers sometimes went numb while she painted, Eleanor made a new demand that crossed a line Lydia hadn't known still existed. She brought a description and rough sketches of a scene she wanted painted, enslaved people working in a cotton field, but happy about it, smiling, singing, content in their bondage. The kind of propaganda painting that justified slavery by portraying it as a benevolent institution where Negroes were protected and provided for and naturally suited to their station. Eleanor explained that a prominent Confederate official was commissioning the painting, that it would hang in a government building in Richmond, that it would help the Southern cause by showing the world the truth about the peculiar institution. She said the word truth without irony, without any acknowledgement that she was demanding Lydia use her gift to create a lie, to betray her people, to paint chains as if they were flower garlands. Lydia refused. It was the first time she had refused anything since her imprisonment began. She said she wouldn't paint it, couldn't paint it, that Eleanor could beat her or starve her or sell her mother, but she would not use her hands to create that particular obscenity. The words came out stronger than she felt, fueled by rage that had been building for months, rage at Eleanor and the world and God and herself for being powerless. Eleanor's response was measured and terrible. She didn't shout or hit Lydia. She simply left the basement, locked the door, and didn't return for 3 days. No food, no water, no light except the small window that showed day turning to night, turning to day. Lydia survived by licking condensation from the stone walls and trying to ignore the hunger that consumed her from the inside. She survived, but barely, and when Eleanor finally returned with food and water and that cold smile, Lydia understood that she would paint the propaganda piece because the alternative was death. She painted enslaved people picking cotton with smiles on their faces. She painted a sun that looked warm and gentle instead of brutal and punishing. She painted an overseer who looked paternal rather than threatening. She painted a lie so convincing that people who saw it would nod and feel comfortable in their prejudices, would point to the painting as proof that slavery was natural and right, and even kind. While she painted, Lydia cried. The tears fell onto her palette and mixed with the colors, diluting them, and she had to keep adding more paint to compensate. She cried and painted, creating a masterpiece of propaganda that would outlive her and carry its poison into the future. When it was finished, Eleanor praised the work effusively, called it Lydia's best painting yet, seemed genuinely pleased with both the technical quality and the subject matter. Lydia felt something break inside her that night. Not her will to survive, because that was too deep and animal to break. Something else. Something harder to name. Her sense that she was still human, maybe, still someone rather than something. She lay on her thin mattress and stared at the darkness and felt herself becoming hollow, felt her spirit being excavated by forces she couldn't fight, felt the gift that had once been joy becoming an instrument of torture. The winter deepened and Lydia's health declined. The damp cold of the basement, the inadequate food, the toxic fumes from the oil paints, the absolute lack of sunlight and fresh air. All of it accumulated in her small body like poison. She developed a cough that wouldn't leave, lost weight she couldn't afford to lose, moved through her days in a fog of exhaustion that made thinking difficult. But still she painted, because stopping meant consequences she couldn't bear, because her mother's life still hung in the balance, because the machine that had claimed her wouldn't release her until it had consumed everything she had to give. Eleanor noticed the decline, but only in terms of how it might affect productivity. She brought better food occasionally, added a thin blanket to Lydia's sleeping arrangements, installed a small stove that did little to combat the pervasive cold. These improvements were purely practical, investments in maintaining a valuable tool, containing no trace of compassion or recognition of Lydia's humanity. Spring arrived outside, bringing warmth and new life to a world Lydia could only glimpse through her small window, and her second year of imprisonment began. She was 11 now, though birthdays meant nothing in the basement where time was measured only in paintings completed and days survived. Eleanor's reputation as an artist had grown considerably. She was invited to show work in Atlanta and Savannah, received commissions from wealthy families across Georgia and South Carolina, was written about in newspapers as a bright light in Southern culture, a reminder that civilization flourished even during wartime. Every word of praise belonged to Lydia. Every painting hanging in parlors and galleries and government buildings had been created by her hands, had been torn from her soul, had cost her pieces of herself that would never be recovered. The injustice of it was so vast that Lydia couldn't hold it all in her mind at once. She could only feel it in fragments, glimpses of rage and sorrow that flared up and then had to be suppressed, because rage and sorrow didn't mix colors or apply brushstrokes. In late spring, Eleanor received her most prestigious commission yet, a series of 6 paintings depicting Southern life and virtue intended as gifts for Confederate generals. The paintings would be large, complex, ambitious. Eleanor was excited in a way Lydia had never seen before, already planning how the commission would cement her reputation, how she would be remembered as one of the great artists of the Confederacy. She explained the requirements to Lydia in detail. 2 landscapes, showing the beauty of southern land, 2 portraits of idealized southern families, and 2 genre paintings showing daily life on plantations. The same propaganda as before, but more sophisticated, more subtle, designed to appeal to educated tastes. Eleanor brought reference materials, photographs, sketches, descriptions, and gave Lydia a deadline of 3 months to complete all 6 works. It was too much. Even for someone with Lydia's gift, 6 major paintings in 3 months would have been challenging under ideal circumstances. In the basement, working with inadequate light and declining health, it was nearly impossible. But impossible didn't matter, because refusal meant consequences that Lydia had learned not to risk. So she began the work, painting for 12 and 14 hours a day, falling asleep at the easel sometimes, waking with brush marks on her face and stiffness in every muscle. The paintings emerged slowly, each one taking pieces of Lydia that she didn't have to spare. She painted plantation houses that looked like palaces instead of prisons. She painted white children playing, while enslaved children watched from the background, smiling as if they enjoyed their exclusion. She painted masters and mistresses who looked wise and benevolent, painted a world that had never existed except in the fantasies of people who needed to believe their cruelty was kindness. And with each painting, Lydia disappeared a little more. The cough that had troubled her through winter became constant, racking her small frame, sometimes bringing up blood. Her hands developed tremors that made fine detail work difficult. Her eyes, strained from years of close work in poor light, began to blur and ache. She was dying, slowly but certainly, consumed by the gift that Eleanor was harvesting like cotton from a field. 2 months into the commission, Lydia began working on the final painting, a landscape that was supposed to show a cotton field at sunset, all golden light and pastoral beauty. Eleanor had provided extensive notes about what she wanted, the composition, the lighting, the mood. But when Lydia looked at the blank canvas, something shifted inside her. A spark of rebellion, a flash of the self she had been before the basement, a refusal to completely disappear without leaving some mark of truth. She painted the landscape as Eleanor had specified, creating the sunset and the cotton field and the distant trees. But in the foreground shadows, where casual viewers might not look closely, where the painting would only reveal itself to those who truly examined it, Lydia painted herself. It was a self-portrait hidden in darkness, her own face emerging from the shadows with eyes that stared directly at the viewer. She painted her exhaustion, her sorrow, her rage, her humanity. She painted herself as witness and victim, as creator and prisoner, as the truth hiding beneath the lie. She painted herself and knew that Eleanor wouldn't notice, wouldn't understand the significance even if she did notice, wouldn't recognize that Lydia had created a secret message in the language of art that might someday be understood by someone with eyes to see. The painting was finished in early August. The 6 works were packed carefully and sent to their destination, and Eleanor glowed with satisfaction at completing such a prestigious commission. Lydia lay on her mattress and coughed blood into a rag and felt death approaching like a slow tide, inevitable and almost welcome. She was 12 years old and she had created art that would survive for generations, art that people would admire and study, art that carried her soul in every brushstroke. But nobody would ever know. Nobody would ever see her name beside her work. Nobody would know that she had existed, had suffered, had given everything she had to give, and then been asked for more. In the basement darkness, Lydia Moore closed her eyes and wondered if disappearing completely might be a kind of freedom. Autumn arrived with cooler temperatures that provided no relief to the damp chill of the basement. Lydia's 12th year was marked by a deterioration so gradual that she barely noticed herself fading. Like a painting left too long in direct sunlight, the colors leaching away imperceptibly until one day you looked and realized the image was half gone. The cough had become her constant companion, a rattling presence in her chest that grew worse at night, keeping her from the sleep her exhausted body desperately needed. Her fingers, which had once moved across canvas with fluid confidence, now trembled and stiffened, requiring willpower to control each stroke. Eleanor noticed the decline because it affected the quality and speed of production. The paintings were still extraordinary. Lydia's gift was too fundamental to be completely eroded by illness, but they took longer to complete, and occasionally Eleanor would find mistakes that needed correction, small imperfections that the old Lydia would never have made. These imperfections enraged Eleanor in ways that Lydia's suffering did not, because imperfections threatened the illusion of Eleanor's genius, threatened the reputation she had built on stolen talent. The punishments became more frequent and more creative. Eleanor withheld food for days at a time, reasoning that hunger would sharpen Lydia's focus. She removed the thin blanket during cold nights, believing that discomfort would motivate faster work. She installed a bell in the basement that she would ring at random hours, disrupting what little sleep Lydia managed to get, keeping her in a state of constant exhaustion that made resistance impossible and obedience automatic. But the cruelest punishment was the complete severing of contact with Ruth. Lydia hadn't seen her mother in 4 months, hadn't heard her voice, hadn't felt her embrace. Eleanor claimed Ruth was still on the plantation, still alive and well, still safe as long as Lydia continued producing paintings, but Lydia had no way to verify these claims. For all she knew, her mother had already been sold, or had died, or had simply given up and let grief consume her. The uncertainty was its own form of torture, a constant anxiety that gnawed at Lydia's mind while her body weakened. In late September, Eleanor received a letter from a prominent collector in Savannah, who had purchased 3 of Eleanor's paintings and wanted to commission a major work, a large-scale historical painting depicting the founding of Georgia, complete with multiple figures and elaborate detail. The commission came with a substantial payment and the promise of prominent display in a new museum being established to celebrate Confederate history and Southern heritage. Eleanor accepted immediately, seeing the commission as the pinnacle of her fraudulent career, the work that would cement her legacy as one of the South's great artists. She brought the commission details to Lydia with barely contained excitement, laying out sketches and descriptions and historical references across the work table. The painting would need to be 6 feet wide and 4 feet tall, would need to include at least 20 figures in period costume, would need to show ships and buildings and landscape, would need to tell a story of colonial glory and manifest destiny. It was the most ambitious project Eleanor had ever demanded, and she gave Lydia 4 months to complete it. Lydia looked at the blank canvas that had been specially prepared for the commission, at the mountain of preparatory work that would be required, at Eleanor's gleaming eyes that saw only opportunity and reputation and money, never the dying child who would have to create this masterpiece while chained in a basement. Something inside Lydia, some last reserve of will that had sustained her through 2.5 years of imprisonment, simply gave up. She told Eleanor she couldn't do it, that she was too sick, that her hands didn't work right anymore, that the painting was beyond her capacity. Eleanor's face transformed from excitement to fury in an instant. She grabbed Lydia's chin with one hand, her fingers digging painfully into the child's hollow cheeks, forcing Lydia to meet her eyes. She said that Lydia would complete the painting because the alternative was unthinkable, because Ruth's life still hung in the balance, because Lydia existed for no purpose except to create art that Eleanor could claim. She said that if Lydia failed, if she refused, if she died before completing the commission, then Eleanor would make sure Ruth suffered for her daughter's defiance, would make sure the punishment was creative and prolonged and absolutely devastating. The threat worked because it always worked, because Eleanor had identified the one leverage that could control Lydia no matter how broken she became. Lydia nodded her submission, and Eleanor released her chin, leaving fingerprint bruises that would fade long before the emotional damage did. Eleanor left the basement in a swirl of skirts and satisfaction, and Lydia turned to face the enormous blank canvas that would consume the last of her strength and probably her life. She began the preparatory work the next day, creating detailed sketches that mapped out the composition, determined the placement of figures, established the perspective and lighting. Even in her weakened state, even with trembling hands and blurred vision, Lydia's fundamental understanding of art remained intact. She knew instinctively how to balance the composition, how to guide the viewer's eye, how to create depth and movement and narrative within a static image. The gift that had been her curse was still there, still functioning, still producing miracles even as the vessel that contained it crumbled. The actual painting began in early October and quickly became a form of prolonged dying. Lydia worked from dawn until her lamp ran out of oil each night, standing at the easel until her legs gave out, and she had to work sitting down, mixing colors until her fingers bled from the cold and the chemicals, applying paint with brushes that grew heavier with each passing day. The historical scene took shape slowly. Ships arriving in harbor, colonists establishing their settlement, Native Americans watching from the tree line, all of it rendered with meticulous attention to period detail and historical accuracy. Eleanor had provided extensive research materials, but Lydia added her own touches, small elements that transformed the painting from mere illustration into something more complex and troubling. The colonists' faces showed determination, but also greed. Hunger for land and power barely concealed beneath civilized veneers. The Native Americans' expressions held knowledge of what was coming, a prescient sorrow that made their static poses dynamic with unspoken tragedy. The sky Lydia painted was beautiful but ominous, suggesting that the founding moment being celebrated contained the seeds of future violence and injustice. None of these subtleties were conscious choices. Lydia was too exhausted for conscious artistry. She simply painted what her hands knew to paint, what her gift demanded, and the truth bled through despite Eleanor's specifications and despite the propaganda purpose the painting was meant to serve. Truth had a way of asserting itself in Lydia's work, showing up in shadows and expressions and compositional choices that revealed more than surface appearances suggested. By November, the painting was half finished and Lydia was dying. There was no longer any question about it. No way to pretend that illness was temporary or that youth and resilience would pull her through. Her body had been pushed beyond its limits for too long, had been deprived of too much: sunlight, fresh air, adequate nutrition, human connection, hope. The banzo that consumed enslaved people who lost the will to live had taken root in Lydia's spirit, and it was finishing what malnutrition and toxic fumes and physical exhaustion had started. She coughed constantly now, great racking spasms that left her gasping and weak, that brought up blood in quantities that frightened even her. Her appetite had disappeared completely. Food tasted like ash and sat heavy in her stomach, and most days she ate only because Eleanor forced her to, standing over her and threatening consequences until Lydia choked down enough to sustain another day of work. Her weight had dropped so dramatically that the chain around her ankle kept slipping off, requiring Eleanor to have it tightened, her adjustment that left raw sores where the metal rubbed against skin stretched tight over bone. Her vision was failing too, not just from the strain of close work in poor light, but from some deeper deterioration that made the world appear increasingly dim and blurred. She had to work closer and closer to the canvas to see details, had to mix colors by feel as much as by sight, had to trust muscle memory and instinct to compensate for eyes that no longer reliably reported what they saw. Some days the basement seemed to darken around her, even though the lamp burned steadily, as if her consciousness itself was flickering and fading, preparing for extinction. Eleanor saw all of this and cared only to the extent that it threatened the commission's completion. She brought a doctor to examine Lydia once, a nervous man who took one look at the chained child in the basement and clearly wanted no part of whatever moral compromise he was being asked to participate in. He listened to Lydia's chest, looked at her eyes, checked her pulse, and told Eleanor with obvious discomfort that the girl was severely ill, that she needed rest and proper food and fresh air and sunlight, that without significant changes to her circumstances, she would likely die within months. Eleanor dismissed the doctor's concerns with practiced ease. She said the girl was prone to exaggeration, that she was being well cared for, that surely there was medicine that could address the immediate symptoms without requiring dramatic lifestyle changes. The doctor prescribed tonics and cough suppressants, accepted his payment, and left with visible relief, choosing to believe Eleanor's reassurances rather than confront the obvious truth of what was happening in that basement. It was easier that way. It always was. The tonics did nothing. Lydia continued to deteriorate, and the painting continued to grow, the two processes inversely related. As the canvas filled with life and color and historical pageantry, the artist creating it emptied out, becoming a shell, a ghost, a fading presence barely tethered to existence. By early December, Lydia was working in a haze of fever and delirium, no longer entirely certain what was real and what was hallucination. Sometimes she saw her mother standing in the corner of the basement, smiling and singing the old songs. Sometimes she saw Shadow, the wolf from William Robinson's story that she had heard whispered in the quarters years ago. A ghost animal keeping vigil over another dying child. Sometimes she saw angels or demons or nothing at all. Just darkness pressing in from all sides, but her hands kept working. Even when her mind wandered, even when she couldn't remember where she was or why she was painting, her hands remembered. They mixed colors and loaded brushes and applied paint with the accumulated skill of years of forced practice. The gift that had been her curse remained faithful to the end, continuing to produce beauty even as the vessel containing it approached total failure. Eleanor grew increasingly anxious as Lydia's condition worsened and the deadline approached. She had promised the painting by Christmas, had already spent part of the commission payment, had told the collector that the work was proceeding magnificently. She couldn't afford for Lydia to die before completing it. Couldn't afford the embarrassment and financial loss, couldn't afford to have her fraud exposed through the simple mechanism of the tool breaking before the job was done. She tried various strategies to keep Lydia alive and working. She brought better food that Lydia couldn't eat. She adjusted the work schedule to allow more rest that Lydia couldn't take because nightmares and pain made sleep impossible. She brought a small heater that did nothing to combat the damp cold that had seeped into Lydia's bones. She even, in a moment of panic, when she found Lydia unconscious at the easel, brought Ruth to visit, thinking that maternal presence might somehow revive the dying girl. The visit was brief and devastating. Ruth hadn't seen her daughter in 6 months, hadn't known the extent of the physical decline, hadn't fully understood what was being done to Lydia in Eleanor's basement. When she saw the skeletal child chained to the wall, saw the blood-stained rags and the hollow eyes and the paintings that surrounded her daughter like beautiful accusations, Ruth's scream echoed through the house with such raw anguish that even Eleanor looked uncomfortable. Ruth held Lydia and wept and begged Eleanor to stop, to let the child rest, to show mercy, to remember that this was a human being, a child, someone's daughter. She offered to take Lydia's place, to work twice as hard, to do anything if Eleanor would just let Lydia go. Eleanor listened to these pleas with the mild annoyance of someone being asked to make an irrational business decision. She explained that Lydia had a job to finish, that the work was nearly complete, that afterward there would be time for rest and recovery. She said it as if she believed it, as if the obvious reality of Lydia's imminent death was invisible to her, as if will and wishful thinking could override physical collapse. The visit ended with Ruth being dragged away, still weeping, and Lydia returned to work with tears streaming down her face, painting through blurred vision, adding her grief to the image of colonial founding that had become her final masterpiece. She painted ships that looked like coffins, colonists whose faces held the blank righteousness of those who cause suffering without acknowledging it, a sky that suggested judgment deferred but not forgotten. She painted her own death into a celebration of beginning, encoded her suffering into a myth of glory, created a palimpsest where truth showed through lies for anyone with eyes willing to see. The painting was completed 3 days before Christmas. Lydia applied the final brushstrokes in a state of near-complete dissociation, her body moving automatically while her consciousness floated somewhere distant and disconnected. When she set down the brush for the last time, she felt no triumph or relief or satisfaction, just a vast emptiness and a bone-deep exhaustion that suggested her body had been waiting for permission to stop fighting. Eleanor came to collect the finished painting and found it even better than she had hoped. Technically flawless, historically detailed, compositionally brilliant, exactly the kind of work that would cement her reputation as a major artist. She praised Lydia effusively, called the work magnificent, promised that now Lydia could rest and recover. She said these things cheerfully, apparently oblivious to the fact that Lydia was barely conscious, that her breathing was shallow and labored, that death was quite obviously approaching. The painting was taken away to be framed and delivered. Eleanor left the basement in high spirits, already composing in her mind the story she would tell about the creative process, the struggles and inspirations, the personal meaning the work held for her. She locked the door behind her, and Lydia was alone again with her chains and her dying body and the toxic fumes that still lingered from months of oil paint application. Lydia lasted 3 more days. They were days of increasing confusion and decreasing consciousness, of fever dreams that blended memory and fantasy, of pain that had moved beyond acute suffering into a kind of numb inevitability. She drifted between sleep and waking without clear distinction, saw visions of her mother and her father and old Isaiah from the quarters, and Shadow the wolf, and angels, whose faces looked like paintings she had created. She felt the chain on her ankle but couldn't remember why it was there. She felt cold but couldn't remember ever being warm. She felt her body shutting down system by system, felt herself becoming less substantial, felt the boundary between existing and not existing growing increasingly porous. On the 3rd day, which was December 28, 1862, Lydia Moore stopped breathing. There was no drama to it, no final words or gestures, no moment of clarity or peace. She simply slipped from labored breathing to no breathing at all, from barely alive to definitively dead, her body giving up its struggle without fanfare or witness. She died alone in the basement, chained to the wall, surrounded by paint fumes and darkness, 12 years old and already used up completely. Eleanor found the body the next morning when she came to bring breakfast and discuss the next commission. She stood in the doorway for a long moment, staring at the small corpse on the mattress, her expression cycling through surprise and annoyance and calculation. There was no grief, no remorse, no acknowledgement that she had killed a child as surely as if she had put a gun to the girl's head. There was only the practical consideration of disposal and the social consideration of maintaining appearances. She had 2 enslaved men remove the body after dark, wrapped in the same thin blanket Lydia had used for warmth. They buried her in the far corner of the plantation, in the section reserved for slaves who died without family to claim them, in a grave, without marker or ceremony. Ruth wasn't told for 2 days, wasn't allowed to see the body, wasn't given any opportunity for goodbye or grieving, or the basic human dignity of acknowledging her daughter's death. When she finally learned what had happened, her wail of anguish echoed across the plantation, a sound so profound in its sorrow that even the hardest overseers looked away and felt briefly ashamed. Eleanor went into public mourning, but not for Lydia. She mourned her lost inspiration, the mysterious force that had enabled her artistic flowering and had now inexplicably departed. She told visitors that the grief of war had finally caught up with her, that the sorrow of her son dying in battle, Marcus had been killed at Antietam, news that had reached her 2 weeks before Lydia's death, had dried up the wellspring of creativity that had sustained her work. She accepted condolences and support, played the role of bereaved mother and blocked artist with convincing sincerity, and quietly began planning her retirement from public artistic life. She had enough paintings already completed to maintain her reputation. She had the substantial proceeds from years of commissions and sales. She had the historical painting that would be her legacy, already hanging in the new museum in Savannah, already being praised as a masterwork of Southern art. She could afford to stop now, to step back and be remembered for the artistic burst that had defined her middle years, to live comfortably on the reputation that Lydia Moore had created and paid for with her life. The war continued for another 2.5 years, ultimately ending in Confederate defeat and the collapse of the society that had sustained slavery. Magnolia Creek Plantation was burned during Sherman's march to the sea, the main house reduced to blackened timbers and rubble, the fields left fallow and reverting to wilderness. The enslaved people scattered, seeking family members who had been sold away, heading north toward promised freedom, trying to build lives from the ashes of bondage. Ruth survived the war but never recovered from Lydia's death. She lived another 15 years, working as a washerwoman in Savannah, always searching for information about what had happened to her daughter, always hoping for some confirmation or closure that never came. She died in 1877, never knowing the full extent of what Lydia had endured, never knowing that her daughter's art had survived and was being celebrated, never knowing that Lydia's final act of rebellion, that hidden self-portrait in the shadows, was still waiting to be discovered. Eleanor Vance lived to be 73, dying in 1893 of natural causes in comfortable circumstances. She was remembered in her obituary as a talented artist whose brief but brilliant career had produced works of lasting value, as a pillar of the community, as a woman who had maintained dignity and grace through personal tragedy and societal upheaval. The obituary mentioned her late husband and her son who had died in the war. It did not mention Lydia Moore. The paintings survived. That was art's terrible power and its terrible irony. It outlasted the people who created it, outlasted the circumstances of its creation, outlasted memory and truth and justice. Lydia's work, signed with Eleanor's name, passed through generations of owners, moved from private collections to museums, was studied and analyzed and praised by critics who marveled at the technical skill and emotional depth, who wondered at the mysterious period of intense productivity followed by artistic silence. The 6 major commission paintings ended up scattered across different institutions. The historical painting of Georgia's founding became a centerpiece of the Savannah Museum's permanent collection, displayed prominently, used in educational materials, reproduced in textbooks. The propaganda painting of happy enslaved people working in cotton fields was purchased by a private collector and eventually donated to a Southern Heritage Society, where it was used for decades to support the mythology of benevolent slavery. The landscape with Lydia's hidden self-portrait went to a museum in Charleston, where it hung for over a century before anyone looked closely enough to see what was hiding in the shadows. That discovery came in 1968, when a graduate student researching Southern art was examining paintings attributed to Eleanor Vance and noticed something strange in the shadows of the cotton field landscape. Using magnification and careful observation, she identified what appeared to be a face emerging from the darkness in the foreground. A black child's face with haunting, sorrowful eyes that seemed to stare directly at the viewer. The discovery was puzzling because Eleanor Vance had never included such elements in her other work, because the face seemed stylistically different from the rest of the painting, because its emotional content contradicted the pastoral beauty of the landscape. The graduate student, a young black woman named Dr. Catherine Mitchell, began investigating further. She examined other paintings attributed to Eleanor Vance, looking for similar anomalies, studying the technique and style for inconsistencies. She researched Eleanor's biography, looking for information about her artistic training and development. She found records of the commissions and sales, documentation of Eleanor's sudden burst of productivity in the early 1860s, followed by equally sudden retirement. The more she investigated, the less the official story made sense. Dr. Mitchell's research led her eventually to plantation records, to bills of sale and property inventories, to the fragmentary documentation of lives considered too insignificant to record in detail. She found Ruth Moore's name in Magnolia Creek records, found mention of a daughter named Lydia, found the gap where both names disappeared from the plantation ledgers in late 1862. She found Eleanor Vance's household accounts from the same period, found unexplained purchases of artist supplies in quantities far exceeding what one painter would need, found payments to doctors and references to an unnamed illness. She interviewed descendants of people who had been enslaved at Magnolia Creek, old men and women who remembered stories their grandparents had told, stories about a girl who had been taken to the big house and never came back, about paintings that appeared suddenly as if by magic, about a mother's grief that had never healed. The stories were fragmentary and sometimes contradictory, distorted by time and trauma and the unreliability of oral history, but they pointed consistently toward the same conclusion. Eleanor Vance had not created the paintings attributed to her. Someone else had, someone whose name and existence had been deliberately erased. Dr. Mitchell published her findings in 1972 in a paper titled The Invisible Artist: Evidence of Enslaved Labor in Southern Art Production. The paper was controversial and widely dismissed by the art establishment, which had significant investments, financial, reputational, institutional, in maintaining the authentication of works attributed to Eleanor Vance. Critics argued that Dr. Mitchell's evidence was circumstantial, that the face in the shadows could be explained as artistic fancy, that there was no definitive proof connecting Lydia Moore to the paintings. The debate continued for years, with some scholars supporting Dr. Mitchell's conclusions and others defending Eleanor's authorship. Museums were reluctant to revise their attributions without incontrovertible proof, and such proof was difficult to obtain for work created over a century earlier, under circumstances specifically designed to conceal the truth. The paintings remained attributed to Eleanor Vance in most institutional records, with occasional footnotes mentioning the disputed authorship. But Dr. Mitchell's work had planted a seed that grew slowly over subsequent decades. As art history grappled with questions of attribution and authenticity, as institutions began acknowledging their roles in perpetuating historical injustices, as technologies improved for analyzing paintings and detecting the presence of multiple hands or hidden elements, the case of Lydia Moore gained renewed attention. In 2019, advanced imaging technology was used to examine the paintings more thoroughly. X-ray fluorescence, infrared reflectography, and other techniques revealed layers of information invisible to casual observation. They found evidence of compositional changes and stylistic variations that suggested multiple artistic hands or significant evolution in technique over very short periods. They found, in several paintings, small anomalies, faces in shadows, figures barely visible beneath later paint layers, elements that seemed to tell a different story than the surface image suggested. Most significantly, they found in 5 different paintings small, carefully hidden marks that appeared to be the initials LM worked into shadows or background details in ways that would be invisible unless you knew to look for them. 5 paintings, 5 signatures, 5 quiet rebellions against erasure, 5 attempts by a dying child to leave evidence that she had existed, had created, had mattered. The art world responded slowly and reluctantly, as institutions always do when asked to confront uncomfortable truths about their collections. Some museums revised their attributions to read, attributed to Eleanor Vance, disputed, or Eleanor Vance, possibly with studio assistance. A few, particularly those with specific commitments to acknowledging historical injustices, went further and reattributed the works to unknown enslaved artist, possibly Lydia Moore, or Lydia Moore, attributed to Eleanor Vance. But most institutions, even those acknowledging the possibility or probability of Lydia's authorship, maintained Eleanor's name as primary attribution. They cited uncertainty about the extent of Lydia's contribution, the impossibility of definitively proving authorship after so much time. The precedent that attribution changes required incontrovertible evidence. Behind these scholarly justifications lay more practical considerations: collections valued in millions of dollars, donor relationships built on existing attributions, educational materials and catalogs that would need revision, the simple institutional inertia that makes change difficult, even when change is right. And so Lydia Moore remains largely invisible in the year 2025, more than 160 years after her death. Some scholars know her name and argue for recognition of her work. Some museums acknowledge in small text on wall labels that attribution is disputed. Some activists protest outside institutions that continue displaying her work under Eleanor Vance's name. But for the vast majority of visitors to museums and galleries across the South, the paintings are still the work of Eleanor Vance, talented Southern artist whose brief, brilliant career produced masterpieces that continue to move and inspire viewers generations later. The paintings themselves remain magnificent. Time has not diminished their technical skill or emotional power. The landscapes still draw viewers into their carefully composed depths. The portraits still capture something essential about their subjects that transcends mere physical likeness. The historical painting of Georgia's founding still commands attention with its scale and detail and narrative complexity. The propaganda painting of enslaved people in cotton fields still serves as evidence, though not the evidence Eleanor intended, of how art can be weaponized to support injustice. And in the Charleston Museum, the landscape with the hidden self-portrait still hangs in a prominent position, viewed by thousands of visitors each year. Most of them never look closely at the shadows in the foreground, never notice the face hidden there, never see Lydia Moore staring out at them across more than a century and a half, her eyes asking to be seen, to be acknowledged, to be remembered. Occasionally someone pauses and looks more closely, drawn by something they can't quite articulate, some sense that the painting contains more than its surface beauty suggests. They lean in and peer at the shadows, and sometimes, if the light is right and they're paying attention, they see her. A black child's face, emaciated and sorrowful, with eyes that seem to hold both accusation and plea. They see her and feel unsettled, feel that something is wrong even if they can't immediately identify what. Most of them move on without investigating further, without reading the wall text that mentions in small print the disputed attribution, without connecting the face in the shadows to the story of theft and abuse and murder that the painting contains. They move on to the next painting, the next gallery, the next experience, and Lydia Moore returns to invisibility, returns to being a shadow hidden in shadows, a ghost in someone else's painting, a story that the world has chosen not to hear. But she's there. She will always be there, hidden in the work she created, waiting to be found, waiting for the day when the world is finally ready to see what it has been refusing to acknowledge, that genius and suffering can coexist, that beauty can emerge from brutality, that humanity persists even in circumstances designed to destroy it, and that art created by enslaved hands belongs to those hands, not to the masters who claimed it. Lydia Moore died at 12 years old, used up and discarded, buried in an unmarked grave, her name erased from the work she created. But her gift survived, her truth survived, her face in the shadows survived. And perhaps that is its own kind of immortality, its own kind of justice, incomplete and delayed and inadequate, but present nonetheless. In the basement of the Charleston Museum, in storage rooms not accessible to the public, curators have preserved fragments of the historical record related to Eleanor Vance and her disputed works. There are Eleanor's personal papers, her letters and diaries and household accounts. There are plantation records from Magnolia Creek. There are bills of sale and property inventories. There are newspaper clippings about Eleanor's artistic career. There are scholarly articles arguing about attribution. There are Dr. Catherine Mitchell's original research notes donated to the museum after her death in 2003. And there is one other item found in 2015 during renovations of a building that once served as slave quarters near where Magnolia Creek Plantation had stood. Archaeologists excavating the site found, buried in what had been the corner of a cabin floor, a small bundle wrapped in oilcloth. Inside were several pieces of cloth painted with berry juice, crude paintings created by a child's hand, showing faces and birds and scenes of plantation life. And beneath the paintings was a scrap of paper, probably torn from a ledger book, with words written in careful, uncertain letters. My name is Lydia Moore. I made these pictures. I am real. The bundle is preserved in acid-free containers in climate-controlled storage. It's catalogued and documented and occasionally brought out for researchers to examine. But it's not on display, not part of any exhibition, not something the public knows exists. It's just another artifact in storage, another piece of evidence waiting for the day when the story it tells becomes impossible to ignore. When institutions and individuals finally decide that truth matters more than tradition, that justice delayed for 160 years is worth pursuing even now, that a 12-year-old enslaved girl who painted masterpieces in a basement prison deserves to have her name restored to the work she created with her dying hands. That day may come, or it may not. But Lydia Moore's paintings survive, and her face hidden in shadows survives, and the truth survives, waiting patiently the way truth always waits, knowing that eventually, inevitably, what has been buried will surface, what has been hidden will be revealed, and what has been stolen will be recognized for the theft it always was. Lydia Moore was real. She created beauty that outlived her by more than a century. She deserves to be remembered. She deserves to be honored. She deserves to have her name spoken when people stand before her work and feel their hearts break a little at the skill and sorrow rendered in oil and canvas. She deserves more than invisibility. She deserves more than shadows. She deserves what was stolen from her: recognition, acknowledgement, the simple human dignity of having her existence and her achievement acknowledged by the world she enriched with her suffering. Until that acknowledgement comes, she waits in the paintings, in the shadows, in the hidden signatures, in the fragmentary records, in the stories passed down through generations, in the conscience of anyone willing to see what history has tried to hide. She waits, and her eyes, painted in shadows, stare out at the world that refuses to see her, asking the question she asked in life, and asks still in death. Do you see me? Do you see me? Do you see me now?
They say just forget. Move on like it's easy. But forgetting you feels like remembering someone I've never seen. I've been trying to erase you from the places in my mind, but the harder that I fight it, the more you're hard to leave behind. Every memory keeps slipping through the cracks I try to close, like a face I should remember, but somehow never know. Forgetting you feels impossible, like chasing something I can't hold, like trying to remember someone that I've never even known. I keep reaching through the silence for a past I can't undo, 'cause letting go of what we had feels like losing something true. Every moment turns to fragments, every thought just fades to blue, like I'm searching for a feeling that still only leads to you. Forgetting you feels impossible, like chasing something I can't hold, like trying to remember someone that I've never even known. I keep reaching through the silence for a past I can't undo, 'cause letting go of what we had feels like losing something true. But now every empty moment still reminds me what is real. Forgetting you feels impossible, like chasing something I can't hold, like trying to remember someone that I've never even known. I keep reaching through the silence for a past I can't undo, 'cause letting go of what we had feels like losing something true. Don't pity me. My heart doesn't need your mercy. I can still stand on my own. I was broken by your leaving, fell deeper than I thought I would, but pain has taught me how to heal now and survive what once I couldn't. You don't have to look back sadly, don't reach out with guilty hands. What you shattered made me stronger, now I rise where I once collapsed. My heart doesn't need your pity, not another empty sign. I've got enough strength left within me to rebuild this life of mine. My feet are steady through the sorrow, I can stand through all the pain. You don't have to save me, darling, I'll learn to breathe again. I once begged for your affection, now I've learned my worth in scars. And the man you left in pieces found his own way through the dark. My heart doesn't need your pity, not another empty sign. I've got enough strength left within me to rebuild this life of mine. My feet are steady through the sorrow, I can stand through all the pain. You don't have to save me, darling, I'll learn to breathe again. So keep your sympathy behind you, I don't need what's left undone. Sometimes losing who once broke you is how healing has begun. My heart doesn't need your pity, not another empty sign. I've got enough strength left within me to rebuild this life of mine. My feet are steady through the sorrow, I can stand through all the pain. You don't have to save me, darling, I'll rise alone again. I'll rise alone